Our other panelist this afternoon is Dr. Mick Smyer. Mick actually taught for a little while at Penn State, and Rachel was one of Mick's students at Penn State, and Cheryl Kaus, our retiring Dean of Social and Behavioral Sciences, was also one of Mick's students, and Cheryl will hopefully be with us at some point today. She had to go home because her furnace was broken. Normally in April you wouldn't worry much about that, but climate change seems to have changed that, and she'll be back with us in a bit. Dr. Smyer, after being before going to Penn State, he earned his undergraduate degree in psychology at Yale University, and then he went on to get a degree in clinical and social psychology at Duke University. After Penn State, he became the vice president. I just lost what I had on here. He became the vice president of research at Boston College, not university, Boston College, big difference. He was there for a number of years, head of research at that university. Then he became the provost at Bucknell University, and he spent about 7 or 8 years as provost. It sometimes seemed like 10 years, he was telling us earlier, but it wasn't so bad. He stepped down as provost back into his psychology position, and now he's changed kind of his encore career is studying how climate change intersects with older adults, but specifically how older adults can be champions of sustainability and climate action.
So first I want to thank Dave and his colleagues for having me here. I'm reminded of a story of Lyndon Johnson. Many years ago when he was president, he had a dinner at the White House. And he was sitting at one end of the table, and he had Bill Moyers, one of his assistants, sitting at the other end, and Bill was a minister. And he asked Moyers to say grace before the meal. Moyers started praying, and Johnson said, "Speak up, I can't hear you." Moyers looked up and said, "I'm not talking to you." As Dave said, I work on a project called Gray and Green, Climate Action for an Aging World. And the premise behind Gray and Green is very simple. There are two global patterns that are going on, and it's time to look at the intersection of those two. The first is we're an aging country in an aging world. About 60 million older adults in the U.S., 60 and over right now, projected to be 100 million by mid-century. Worldwide, 1 billion right now, 60 and over, 2 billion by mid-century, 3 billion by the end of the century. So we're an aging country in an aging world. Aging is a growth field. But we're also a world that's struggling with climate change. I don't need to tell this audience a lot of the facts and figures. 97% of climate scientists know that climate change is real, it's happening, and if anything, its effects are accelerating much more quickly than our climate models had predicted. But interestingly enough, most climate scientists haven't thought about the connection between these two patterns. For the last 3 years, I've been working on this project, Gray and Green. And when I talk to climate scientists, I pitch them about the importance of the intersection of population aging and climate change. And I get a one-word answer. You know what that word is? Huh. Now, the first time I did that, I thought, oh, this is not going well. And then I realized, is science talk for, that's not crazy. I just never thought about it. Because what I'm asking people to do is to think about older people not solely as victims of climate change, as Rachel focused on in her presentation. 2/3 of the mortality in Hurricane Sandy were people 65 and over. But I'm thinking about the other part of the older adults. That is, older adults not solely as victims of climate change, but as potential leaders of climate action. And that's the focus of my efforts in Gray and Green. So what I want to do today is to ask a simple question. When it comes to climate change, how do we break our silence on climate change? How do we break our habit of silence on climate change? Now, to answer that question, I turn to an important applied behavioral scientist, Warren Buffett, the omen from Omaha, who said, chains of habit are too light to be felt until they're too heavy to be broken. If you remember nothing else from this part of the talk, just remember the word habit. Because we've gotten into some climate habits, and I'm going to show you some of the habits we have right here in your area with some data. These data come from a website called the Climate Advocacy Lab. Anybody look at the Climate Advocacy Lab? Anybody know that website? Great. It's a great website, free. It provides a lot of information on climate issues. And one of the source of information is the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. And what the Yale folks have done is they have an app on the Climate Advocacy Lab so that you can enter your zip code or your congressional district, and you can download public opinion data on a variety of climate issues down to your congressional district or your county or your zip code. So I said, how about Atlantic County, New Jersey, where Stockton is? What do folks here think about climate change? You with me so far? Does it make sense? So what do we find? We find that 73% of folks in this county, let's see if I can do this. 73% of folks in this county, there we go. 73% of folks in Atlantic County know that climate change is happening. This compares to 75% in New Jersey, so you're a little behind, but not far. And a little ahead of the rest of the United States. So almost 3/4 of the folks who live here in Atlantic County know that something's going on. And a little over half say yes, it's caused mostly by human activities. But only half know that most scientists think global warming is happening. So about half of the folks who live in this county don't know that 97 or 98% of climate scientists attribute global warming to human activity. Turns out that's a gateway belief. Once people know that degree of scientific consensus, they start to think differently themselves about climate change. On the other hand, great level of trust of scientists in this community. Stockton faculty are doing something right. Now, on the other hand, when we ask what percentage discuss global warming at least occasionally, it's only a third. Discuss with their family members or friends global warming, it's only a third. That compares to the United States figure of about 35%. So as a nation, we know something's going on, but we don't talk about it. Does that sound familiar? And it turns out older adults' rates are similar to these rates. I asked the Yale folks to analyze their data by generation. They'd never thought about it. They, by the way, were the first audience that I pitched my project to. They were the first ones who said, huh. And then they said, but wait, we could analyze the data by generation, and they've done that, showing that the boomers are as concerned, but also as silent as the silent generation and the millennials on this topic. So that's the habit, avoidance. Charles Duhigg has summarized social science research on the development of habit. And what he suggests is that we have a cue that leads to a routine that leads to a reward. When it comes to climate issues, here's how it works. The cue is, let's talk about climate science. Or you see something on TV that says, the glaciers are melting. We have droughts. We have floods. And what do? Our routine is too big to worry about. What can one person do? I'm not going to think about it. And the reward is my anxiety decreases. If I block it out, I don't have to worry about it. Does that sound familiar? I'm a psychologist. I can help you with denial. Now, psychology says any kind of habit loop, this is a figure from Angela Duckworth and her colleagues, says, well, we can do several things. One, we can change the appraisal cognitively, or we can change the situation. And over the next few minutes, what I'm going to show you is what we've been doing with gray and green. How do we help people reappraise and act on the knowledge that they already have? If almost 3/4 of your fellow citizens in this county know that climate change is happening, and over half know it's human caused, but less than a third are talking about it, that's a great opportunity. You can move them from anxiety to action to habit on climate change. And the key according to the National Academy of Sciences, is very simple. The key is to make your message social, short, and positive. Kind of like me, social, short, and positive. Social in terms of focusing on people or places that you care about. Short in terms of time frame. Don't talk about your carbon footprint 10,000 years from now, because we're not wired to think that way. And then positive, focus on something that you can do. Social, short, and positive. Now, in Gray and Green, we make an assumption that we're each on a climate journey, and we feel better when we know where we are in that journey and what our next step is. For example, my journey started in 2005. Why 2005? Because I was born and raised in New Orleans. And what happened in 2005? Hurricane Katrina, right. And I wasn't living in New Orleans at the time, but it doesn't matter. If you were born and raised in New Orleans, when Katrina hit, it was a punch to the gut. It was a real heartbreak to see my hometown flooding. Now, if you think of Louisiana, I don't know, you probably don't think of Louisiana, but when you do, this may be the image that comes to mind. The boot, right? On a map, you could identify that as Louisiana, right? That's what I used to think my home state looked like. That's what I like to think my home state looks like. But in fact, this is what Louisiana looks like. And it looks this way because the wetlands have been decimated through a combination of natural and human causes. There's a thing called the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, Mr. Go. And Mr. Go was a shortcut to get the shipping to the Gulf more quickly. Turns out, one of the byproducts, one of the unintended consequences, was that it decimated wetlands. And what do wetlands do? They weaken hurricanes when they come ashore and protect the Gulf Coast. So my climate journey started in 2005 when Katrina hit, and then it accelerated a little over 2 years ago with the arrival of the best-looking grandkids in the world. Let's see, that's Gus and Bailey, my twin grandsons, who are now 2 and wouldn't stand still for a picture like this. And then accelerated again about 3 months ago with the arrival of their cousin Teddy. So what do these kids have to do with climate change? Well, for me now it's very simple. I can envision very easily what their climate will be like when they are, as my daughter says, my age, in 65 years. So now it's no longer hypothetical. I know that the world I'm leaving to Bailey, Gus, and Teddy is not the world that I grew up in. And it gives me a great motivation to work. Now, I'm lucky. I work at Bucknell, and I've been able to, for several years, go to New Orleans on Katrina rebuilding trips. This is a group of Bucknell students. I'm holding a piece of king cake because it's Mardi Gras season. We're doing Katrina rebuild in the lower 9th Ward of New Orleans. I'm lucky I was able to act on my anxiety and do something positive. But enough about me, let's talk about you. I'm going to ask you to do a short experiment. If you have something to write with, this would be good. If not, you can just do this mentally. You ready? This is the wake-up part. I'm going to make 4 simple requests of you. You ready for the first? First, picture a place, any place in the world, that has a special meaning to you. Whoops. Picture a place, any place in the world that has a special meaning to you. Got that place in mind? Picture a place. Second, picture that place affected by extreme weather or climate change. Picture that place affected by extreme weather or climate change. You have that threat in mind? Third, picture that place in 40 to 50 years. Not how you think it'll be, but how you'd like it to be. What your aspiration is for that place. Picture that place, how you'd like it to look in 40 to 50 years. Okay? Fourth and final request, picture something you can do now to work towards that vision you have 40 to 50 years from now. Picture something you can do now to work towards that vision you have 40 to 50 years from now? How many people here have a place they care about? The rest of you don't have a place? Well, let me ask it a different way. How many people don't have a place you care about? Okay, I've done this with hundreds of people. I've only had one person who said there's no place I care about, and he's kind of a curmudgeon, so let's call him Art. I said, Art, what do you mean? He said, well, I don't care about any place except where my kids are. I said, well, where are your kids? He said, San Francisco and Washington. I said, so you got two places. Everybody's got a place they care about. Everybody knows what the threat is. I've done this with hundreds of people. And everybody knows what they'd like it to look like. How many people said to themselves, I'd like it to look like just what it looks like now. I'd like it to stay the same. Yeah, okay. How many people said, I'd like it to look like what it used to look like 40 or 50, 10 or 20 years ago? Okay, that's really good. Usually, older people are the ones who say 10 or 20 years ago because we're living climate memory. But those are the two big answers. Either stay the same or go back, rewind the film a little bit. But how about that fourth question? Something you can do now to work towards that vision that you have. How many people were stumped by that question? Didn't know what to do with that? Okay? I'm a clinical psychologist. If I just left you anxious, that's good for business, but not good for climate action. So remember I said that the key to climate communication is social, short, and positive. And the requests I just made of you are social, short, but not quite positive yet. Social, we focused on people and places you care about. Short, in terms of time frame, I asked you to think about 40 to 50 years. But my experience is that last question, what can you do about it, depending upon the audience, somewhere between 50 to 80% of people are stumped. And that's where the next phase of gray and green comes in. If I just left you with that, it wouldn't be good for climate action. So we developed a card sorting process called Your Climate Journey. And this is, when I do this in a workshop, the whole thing takes about an hour. And what I do is I hand people a deck of cards, climate cards. And the first four cards are the title card, Your Climate Journey. But then we have three category cards. Things I already do, things I could do, and no way. Things I either cannot or will not do. And I ask people to sort 30 climate actions into those three categories. Things I already do, things I could do, and no way. Either I cannot or will not do that. Now, if I were to do this with you individually, it might take 10, 15 minutes at the most. I did it with Rachel over coffee. It took us less than that, but she was drinking caffeinated coffee. But with those categories, we do three things. One is we ask people to first focus on the no way pile. And I make a promise to people, I'm not going to badger you. I'm not going to say do those things. But I just ask them to compare with their neighbors' no way piles. Does anybody have exactly the same no way piles? And it turns out, rarely do people have exactly the same things that are in their no way piles. Why is that important? Psychologists would call this individual differences. I just say we're each on an individualized climate journey. And what's in my no way pile may be different from my spouse's or my friends or my coworkers. Then I turn to the things I already do pile, and I have people do two things. First, I have them count up the number of things they're already doing. There is a line of psychological research that suggests that I look at my behavior and I figure out what my values are. By counting up the number of things I'm doing, I find out, gee, I must care about this. For example, there are 30 cards in the pile. The number of things that people do in workshops that I've done all over the country range from 3 to 23. It's pretty interesting. I haven't had anybody do more than 23. 23 is a lot. But by the time that people have counted it up, they realize, I must care about this. I'm doing a lot. And then I have them turn over the cards. Because we want to track our carbon impact because of the impact of CO2 on greenhouse gases. So on the back of each card is the carbon impact of each of those steps. And I ask people to find the one thing that they're doing that has the biggest carbon impact. And it's pretty interesting because pretty soon the tables in the workshops get competitive, and they want to get triple credit for having hybrid cars if there are 3 at the table. They want 3 credits, not just the 1 credit. But the point is there's a lot of peer interaction and peer education about the impact of different activities by the time they're through with the things I already do pile. But then we get to the middle pile, the things I could do pile. Then I ask them to do one thing. Pick one thing and move it from could do to will do. As an 81-year-old woman said to me recently, you want me to move that from could do to will do. Of course, she then went on to say, I'm not going to do it. She was a pip. But with that one thing that they say they will do, then we move on to making them smart. Are people familiar with SMART goals? Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound? That's what we do in Gray and Green. We try to give people the capacity to develop a SMART goal around their next step on their climate journey. And the way we do that is by a combination of behavioral economics and psychology. We have a climate commitment form in which we ask people to identify, first of all, what's their next step. For example, if you said, I had somebody tell me, I'm going to plant a tree. I said, great, write that down on the form. And then I asked her, what's the schedule? By when are you going to plant that? This was last spring. She said, I'm going to plant it in the next 2 months. I said, why 2 months? She said, because my grandkids are coming and I want them to plant it with me. Great. So she's got a goal, she's got a timetable. But before that, I asked her, who are you going to tell? Who's your buddy? Who's your accountability buddy? And she said she was going to tell her husband. Could be a friend, could be a spouse, could be a coworker. It turns out that just telling one other person increases the odds that you will carry out that activity, just making that public commitment. And then the last part of the contract is kind of a fun part. I ask them to picture a person or an organization whose mission, values, and goals they do not agree with. Got the picture? And then how much money, write that down, and then how much money will they give to that person or organization if they don't carry out the goal on the timetable that they've just set for themselves? Yeah, that nervous laughter is usually what we get. For example, I did a workshop in State College, Pennsylvania, the home of the Pennsylvania State University. And one of the participants said he would give $50 to the Ohio State University if he didn't carry out his goal on the timetable that he set. Now, it turns out when we do this, 80% of the people who say I can follow up with them actually carry through and complete their goal. And those of you who do intervention research know that an 80% success rate is extremely high for this kind of simple intervention. So that's the idea behind Gray and Green. Social, short, and positive. Leveraging the growing resource of older adults, not solely as victims of climate change, but as potential leaders of climate action. Why focus on older adults? Because we have time, and we have talent, and we have a sense of concern for future generations. We also have developed 3 other steps beyond the workshop itself. First, we have a train-the-trainers approach where I can train people in a webinar in a little under an hour to actually run the workshops in their own circles of influence. For example, right now we're doing some work with churches in Massachusetts. I train 1 or 2 people from the church and they can run it in their own congregation. Secondly, we have a kids version of the card deck. The only problem with the kids version is that people steal them, especially grandparents. They're very shifty. So I have some, but I will only show them to you under my supervision. We develop these for use in classrooms, but also with families. It leads to really interesting discussions within a family. Is this a family could-do item? Is this something we already do as a family? Is this in our no-way pile as a family? Really interesting discussions. And this gets back to the habit of not talking about climate change. By doing the card deck, you already have the conversation already set. And finally, there's a website called landtalk.org. Anybody here ever hear of landtalk.org? Great. It's a website developed by a faculty member at Stanford and one at Berkeley, a biologist and an engineer. And the premise behind it is very simple. Trying to get people to upload interviews in which people talk about their memory of places that they care about. Remember that first question I asked you, picture a place you care about. Landtalk.org gives you an opportunity to record your climate memories of those places. And the idea is to get people to populate their website so that we begin to have an archive of places that people care about and what their climate concerns are about them. So the premise behind Gray and Green is very simple. Our time is short. Our time is short individually. Laura Carstensen, psychologist at Stanford, says that somewhere in your early to mid-50s, your sense of time changes, and you begin to think about time left to live. So for older adults, that sense of time urgency is actually something that we can leverage and use. Secondly, the climate's crisis time is short. If anything, our models have been too conservative. Climate change is happening. It's real. The Defense Department calls climate change a strategic threat multiplier. And if it's good enough for DOD, it's good enough for me. So in the end, older adults are a resource not only to be concerned about as victims of climate change, but also as potential leaders of climate action. So one of our themes is that their concern about future generations can be leveraged to move them from anxiety to action to habit on climate change. So a healthy planet is your legacy, it's my legacy, it's our legacy, and it's time to pass it on. So thank you for your attention, and I'm open for questions or comments. The question is, there are things we can do individually, but so much of our concern is caused by corporations or big organizations. What can we do to move them? They worry about the bottom line. So I think there are 2 or 3 different strategies. One is to apply the metrics of business to the business of climate change. There's a project called Risky Business. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Risky Business was a project that was launched by a bipartisan group of business types. Hank Paulson, former Secretary of the Treasury, Michael Bloomberg, Tom Steyer. So already you see it's got a range of political views, all of them coming from the business community. And they did a very simple and smart thing. They said, let's apply the business discipline of risk assessment and apply that to climate change and its impacts in 2 areas, health impacts and economic impacts by region of the U.S., by region of the country. They've put out a series, and they continue to put out a series of reports on the economic impact of climate change by region, both in terms of healthcare impact and economic impact. So one step is to use the resources already developed to make the business case that responding to climate change makes good economic sense. The other is to use the power of investments or divestments. For example, a number of universities are having conversations about divesting from fossil fuel or unsustainable corporations and organizations. So those are two of the steps that you can use as an individual. And of course, the third is to vote for individuals in the local, regional, state, and federal offices who acknowledge and understand that climate change is real, is happening, and we need to respond to it. Citizens Climate Lobby, for example, focuses on one issue, carbon tax, but there are other issues. There's now a bipartisan climate lobby that has been developed in Washington, 1 for 1. It has to have 1 Republican and 1 Democrat as it expands, so it's totally bipartisan. So there's a growing acknowledgement on the Hill, but I think we have the power as individual voters to say, I'm going to vote that interest as well as the economic interest. Your question about research and getting it out, the other thing I do in a workshop is, if we were doing this in a workshop, I'd also have you sketch your answer. It turns out that that's another way to get you deeply engaged very quickly. I developed this approach at the design school at Stanford, so it's a combination of psychology and human-centered design. Turns out about 2/3 of our brain is wired to process, either directly or indirectly, visual information. But we lean heavily on the verbal, right? But by sketching, no matter how well you draw, I quickly engage you. Now, you asked a question, research funding. Operators are standing by now, and viewers like you can certainly contribute. I have a couple of grants in. What I'm working on now is scaling this effort, working with a couple of national organizations who are very interested in taking the materials and the approach and disseminating it through their large networks. And we're trying to get foundation and corporate funding to do that. Because I'm convinced the approach gets people very quickly into the project. And now I'm just trying to scale the effort because me going around doing workshops doesn't scale quickly enough. How long have I been working on the project? For about 3 years. I started with just a general idea. I'm going to look at the intersection of population aging and climate change and join the hundreds of people who are doing that. And once I talked to all 6 of them, I decided that, gee, okay. But look, I'll just end with this. Climate change to me is a lot like psychotherapy today. What do I mean by that? I'm a clinical psychologist by training. One of the things we know about psychotherapy is that insight does not lead to behavior change. You have to do more than just having insight. We have insight on climate. The people right here in your county, 3/4 of them know climate change is real. Over half know it's human caused. And yet they're not changing the habit of talking and moving on it. So it seems to me that, yes, we need ongoing climate science. I'm all for that. But it seems to me the behavioral sciences really need to step up and get engaged in moving people from anxiety to action to habit. And that's really important for psychologists and other behavioral and social sciences to bring our expertise into this arena. So again, Dave, thanks for having me, and thanks for your attention this afternoon.
So today's the birthday of one of our faculty members who passed away way too young a few years ago. Nancy Ashton it's her birthday today. I finally took over her course on environmental psychology when I turned 60 and she was gone. And so many of the ways that I think about environmental psychology and sustainability is exactly what Mick just pointed out. It's like our interaction with our natural environment is not all that different from our models of abnormal psychology, where there's a mismatch between what our natural environment needs and how we are behaving. And you can actually take all the different main great paradigms of the field of psychology, and you can use them to consider how to get people to change their behaviors with respect to the natural environment. Mick actually, they finally came out with a new version of the textbook for aging and mental health, and it's just circumstance that climate change was the last part of the last chapter we covered this week as the book gets closed out. Rachel is also an expert in terms of mental health and mental illness. We don't just use Mick's book in some of our classes, but Rachel's written a book entitled Surrounded by Madness about her family experience with a mother with mental illness and an adoptive daughter. And so they both know an awful lot about the things that us in psychology are much more familiar with, mental health and mental illness. And yet they're paradigms that so much work with our understanding of the environment. We in psychology and gerontology wanted to thank Cheryl for her years as our dean here at Stockton. I mentioned earlier that she was trained at Penn State in human development and family studies under Mick and other colleagues at Penn State. Dr. Pruchno was a fellow student of Cheryl's. And Cheryl's been a really strong advocate for all of our programs in social and behavioral sciences, but we're especially grateful for her advocacy in psych and gerontology and for our Center on Aging. With her background in that field, she's decided actually to retire very soon. Before she came to us, I guess after Penn State, she went directly to SUNY Oswego, one of the coldest places on the planet, even though I know she likes it warm. That's one of those places where they have to have underground tunnels to get between buildings, or they put up ropes on the paths so that you don't get blown into the lake from the heavy winds there. But between Penn State and here at Stockton, her time at Oswego, I think she's quite proud of developing a program there at Oswego in human development and family studies, taking after her mentors at Penn State. So on behalf of all of our colleagues in Psych and Gero, thank you to Cheryl for your hard work on our behalf. She won't even come to the front of the room, so I'm not going to try. Hey, Mick, do you have something you want to share with Cheryl? I think he does. We actually have a couple gifts for you, Cheryl. Do you mind coming up? And Dr. Gata Chelder, are you somewheres nearby?
I'm right here.
There you are.
Hi,
Say
Cheryl.
hi to me.
Hi, Cheryl. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. Cheryl, I have a gift for you that I think I'm unique in the audience in being able to give you. I have a bound copy of your dissertation.
I'm cleaning out my house.
Yeah, so am I. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mick.
Yeah.
Wait. I'm Christine Gata-Chelder, current coordinator of the gerontology minor. And all of the faculty in the gerontology minor would like to give you a little goodie so you can go shopping. I've had the honor of getting to know Dean Kaus over the years as an adjunct faculty member, a visiting assistant professor of psychology, and then tenure track. And I'd like to let everyone know something that you may not know, that in the spirit of lifespan development, Dean Kaus, to me and many others, has been a great mentor. She has nurtured many of us to be where we are today across the lifespan. So for me, I was the little adjunct that could. 12 years being an adjunct, she nurtured me and supported me being a full-time faculty member, for which I am very, very grateful. So from the gerontology minor faculty, we will miss you.
So thank you all for coming, and could you please give our speakers another round of applause?